Welcome back to the Wrong Advice Podcast. I'm your host, John Picciuto, and I'm very excited to have my new friend, Lluvia, aka the Bruja PR. How you doing, my friend?
Good. It's good to be here. I'm excited.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you on the pod today. Can you give a quick introduction to the listeners?
Totally. My name is Lluvia. I'm the founder and senior publicist at Bruja PR. And I focus and specialize in authentic storytelling opportunities around music, creatives, and different creative talents and brands. But my forte right now focuses on music PR.
That's awesome. What made you start your own company?
So my background has been pretty scattered between communications and poetry, actually.
Hmm.
And coming from the Bay Area, I found that a lot of my interests really didn't fit in one mold or the other. So I definitely have had the experience where I would, go to an agency, get my experience, kind of get my training grounds, would have, a wonderful time in different environments and different clients. But time and time again, I would find this issue where there would not be enough bandwidth or time in being able to properly connect with someone's story. And that's where the first seedling of a thought of, wow, like we're doing all of this work to really propel your message. We're such a pillar in the way in which you brand, the way in which you expand. And yet there's 30 minutes tops. And then you never speak to your publicist again.
Yeah.
And it's like, and it becomes such a copyright and such a duplicating format of how we then proceed into the actual formula of the work itself. And I just felt that specifically in PR, there was so much opportunity to actually be intimate in that process. And perhaps that's my poetic self, right? That my background is just like a little romantic of it. But I do feel that the more that we're able to connect authentically, the more that we can inject purposeful direction in our messaging. And I think that entire sentiment is void in a lot of our mass consumption right now. And so I wanted to start a space where I really just wanted to bridge more bandwidth and time for artists. And lo and behold, the way it's been unfolding is more demand for that space and kind of still, I would say, supplementing with more like agency resource has been needed. And so I find myself kind of going from a place of this like humble space where I just wanted to complement publicists in a larger scope in being able to just have more time with artists. And now I'm finding that process is actually way more central to a lot of these artists' teams. And I'm like, okay, so how do we better support and empower this vision? And so, in the last year alone, Bruja PR has been exponentially growing, and it's super exciting and just like such a dream.
That's fucking
Yeah.
awesome. What I think's cool about that is the way media, the way storytelling is consumed is ever evolving and ever changing, and that search for authenticity is, in my opinion, probably the most important thing when you're connecting with someone, whether it's a musician, an artist, whatever. And there's a lot of disingenuous storytelling out there centered around music and whatever, and I think that your approach towards it is certainly different from, like you say, like an agency who just wants to get as many eyeballs as possible, as many clicks as possible, and is sort of not antithetical, but like it goes against building and cultivating community, which is, I think, probably the most important thing for an artist in this day and age. Talk to me about like any fears or trepidations you had like going into starting your own business. And obviously it's been a successful year, but I'm sure things start slow, right? It's not like an immediate success. The joke is all overnight successes are 10 years in the making. So give me a little bit of context to, your early days and sort of how you've been able to grow exponentially over the last year.
Yeah. So this is my, I want to say, third or fourth attempt.
Ah, nice.
As a matter of fact, for the last I want to say 10 years, I have tried many different aliases, many different business models, um, and many different vehicles that I think over time, what was really happening is through those chapters, I was gaining my skills and my ethos.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with your ideology, sometimes it does not form into a business blueprint until you're experiencing the alternative ways in which you quote unquote fail.
Oh.
And as a result, I think that there is a shift in the unfolding where you're really being asked to come to terms with grit and the labor of love. And so if the relationship with your business or that of your body of work doesn't come from this place of digesting the mundane, digesting the compromises, digesting the sacrifices, prioritizing your time, I do not think that we're able to colorize our relationship with that which we are being called to do.
I
And
like that.
so I want to say that though this has been, an exponential kind of year, it has come from many years of failure
Mm-hmm.
and adapting and making, the decision where I would go back to an agency, but I was very particular about my time there. And it was as if I would re-enter the spaces and be in a corporate setting. And I have nothing against, doing the different 9 to 5 jobs. For me, it's as if it was a training ground of, if I'm showing up for someone else, can I not show up for myself in the same capacity?
Hmm.
And truthfully, at that age and at that time, I didn't have the capacity to grit my labor of love yet. I was still maturing into that. And so I think in those years, be it LA, New York, be it the Bay Area, that was such, I look back and I go, wow, I really thought that in those moments I was, sacrificing my dream. But in reality, I was being led in a very magnetic way to where I am now. And that's, I think, where I open myself more mystically to the process and how things unfold, that every step along the way becomes so like such a pillar in what is forming as your business blueprint today. Like,
Yeah. No, I
you
think
know,
I think that's crucial because a lot of times, I've been a solo entrepreneur for a couple years now via this podcast, my photography business. I just started a digital marketing company. Like I've been doing the solo, provider life for a while now. And there is like inherent risk, there is inherent stress, but I found, at least in the last 2 years, that as I have facilitated myself towards like what works and how it's like continually manifesting itself in a positive way for me, I'm getting bigger and more
mm-hmm,
more lucrative, higher level opportunities. And I think, like you said, like when you have that sort of reaffirmation of something and it starts clicking, then all of a sudden you're like, whoa, shit, I can do this, I can keep doing this, I
yeah,
can invest more time and more energy into this because it's
right.
paying its dividends. But it's also scary.
It's terrifying because I think it clashes also on a larger scale, this relationship with our idea of security.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so often, at least even from a cultural standpoint, to just, the way in which every aspect of my upbringing has domesticated my belief systems, it's that there is this idea of what it means to have stability and security. And to risk it, to rock the boat, is, at least from a Latina standpoint, it's this value of like, you're not being humble enough. And I don't know if it's the Catholicism or if it's the Mexican
Probably.
heritage, you know what I'm saying? Or if it's like the culmination of both, that you don't talk about the things that are uncomfortable to talk about
Mm-hmm.
and don't ask for more. And as a result, we settle for less.
Yeah.
And so we become very comfortable with being complacent.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I have found in the last 2 years that there was more there was more instability with going in and out of different environments that were not aligned with my ethos than it was to just map out kind of like a set of months and make it such a truth that no matter what, every single month, I'm going to make X amount and it's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And if that means that I have to gig out, or if that means I go support and do a contract with another agency, which I've done and I absolutely love because it propels a more collaborative partnership than that of a competitive one.
Mm-hmm.
So I love working with people who are at my level and have been at my level, got 7 years ahead of me. Like, I find no threat in that. I find no threat in picking up a gig or a job somewhere, so long as it continuously expands my ethical skill set and it's feeding it back. And I have no problem doing that until I have my stride, because I have given my child of a business the time to marinate, seed, and harvest. And I think that is the truest way of almost being like unconditionally in love with your work.
Ooh.
Where it's like, you know what I mean? It's
Mm-hmm.
like, that's the labor part, that the labor part pulses. And it's like a ring of fire, and you have to, even in that space, you have to find your commitment and you have to find your love. And so it becomes a very, in so many ways, it becomes a very like cosmic romantic journey.
I love
And it
that.
has to do with your self-love and self-respect, you know?
You know what's funny? I don't know if it's like an American culture thing, but you mentioned competition, and I agree with that a lot because we're brought up a certain way, and I think there's just some inherent thing about Americans or human beings where everything is a contest, right? Everything is a competition.
Right,
Like, whether it's fucking Instagram followers or how much money I make or what artists you work with or who you're collaborating with, it's all a competition. And I think that one of the cheat codes to becoming the most successful version of yourself is sort of eschewing that mentality, because at the end of the day, the only person I'm competing with is myself. Like, my own wants and desires are the thing that I am going to compete against, because
yeah.
that's all that matters. Like, and I don't know if that's 36-year-old John who's lived long enough of a life to understand what's truly important or not. But there is some inherent feeling of that competitive nature that I think if people were able to, drop it, it would be wildly beneficial for society.
Right, because really, like, there's risk in everything, but it's also coming to terms with being comfortable with embracing the unknown
Mm-hmm.
and having some trust, be it attaining some of that education in mentorship, calling in your soulmate clients, calling in your resources, and being very okay with the aspect that I don't know what I'm doing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that is a very humbling aspect that is more humble than saying I don't want to ask for more.
Ooh, yeah.
And so where we learned this idea that you can't ask for more because you're almost coming from a place of entitlement is so reversed in what it actually yields as an outcome. Really, what we're talking about is, can we release our relationship to outcome driven results? Can we release our relationship to false security? Can we release our relationship to success and the projections of success that have been ideated and that have been instilled from everyone else except you yourself? And what you're left in that space is coming to terms with the present moment and showing up in that present moment with such full, expansive trust and capacity and surrendering, and knowing that that is not at all giving up. Surrendering to the process is actually being more accountable to it, and doing whatever you can if you don't know what you're doing to make sure that there's an ounce of green light coming in from somewhere, and like being okay with, if that means that the answer is not presenting itself right this second, that like pivoting does not mean that you're letting go of the track entirely. And so I think the culmination of all of that is really where I honor kind of the bridge from my cultural background and what I wish to pioneer, embody, and champion. And I see it so prevalent in the way in which I then inject those ethos into my clients' storytelling and how I connect with individuals that are just looking to break barriers just to be themselves. They're not looking to revolutionize much. They're not looking to like resist and resent and reject. They're just looking to be totally okay with coming to terms with their story. If an agency tells you it's not marketable, like there's always a way.
Yeah.
It's just about retargeting. If someone, you know, it's like a redirection in branding, it's like there's a way we can weave this in a graceful manner that at the end of the day, that's almost a mental health,
Yeah.
you know, this, if you will. It's like,
so I love everything that you just said, and I think it's an elevated mindset when it comes to both like life and business. And I'm curious how you've come to cultivate this, you know, forward thinking mindset, because I think it is something that is maybe not lacking, maybe not scarce, but it's certainly not the norm when it comes to being, you know, conscious about one's place in the world and when it comes to running their own company and their business.
well, I do have a background in where I started my PR was actually in political PR.
Oh.
And so I understand from an activist standpoint how to develop the strategy of a campaign from an advocacy standpoint. And all I did was, because I did not pursue political PR, it didn't resonate with me. And that's just kind of the life path that has been taken me, is that I simply replaced an issue or a politician with archetypal narratives. And in that way, that's what I advocate for. And so I always come back to like this space of being able to empower an individual's story and treating it as if it is their political agenda when it comes to developing their campaign. When it comes to music, it's trickled down differently than when it comes to legislation.
Yeah.
But what's happening is there's a lot of energy output in saying like, this is your truth, this is your ideology, this is your philosophy, these are your politics, if you will, without even having to politicize the narrative, if that makes sense.
No, it does. Yeah.
And so I bring it back to this place of like, I think if we were more intentional about the absolute power and significance that is in our individual stories, the less we will feel inclined to, I think, assimilate or construct a story that fits a larger corporate agenda. And in that way, I truly feel as though I am an artist advocate or an activist when it comes to just empowering authenticity. That's like my winning strategy. And there are different ways in which we can leverage our resources, our modalities. But I think because of that political PR in the recent years, it shifted into more like life coaching and spiritual personology modalities. And I weave that into the way in which I hold space and do my intake, where I am in the artist development stage of our work. Because in the landscape of PR, I think it's molding into more of that of branding and that of marketing, and that of consultation. And if you are not able to have kind of the presentation or the skill sets to govern that space by meeting that space with your own healed capacity, you will have missed kind of the magic of it.
Yeah.
And many times also the blockages, whether it's a writer's block, you know, I go into the studios and I work also with artists where they're not at the marketing stage. But again, I follow the space of artist development as an active service. And so whether that's me, you know, starting to see the artist bio at that stage, or if it's just being in the studio and curating a safe space in which you can fully express your full spectrum of creativity, that's super important. And it's going to matter later on in the ways in which that I continue that dialogue and that space when I quote unquote market you. But really, it's that I'm amplifying a story that you already have. You're just needing to like have the safe space to clear the blockages and express it yourself. So I'm just a facilitator.
No, I love that though, because I look at intentionality as being one of the most important lessons I've learned in my life, and because for a long time I did almost nothing with intention. I went about life in a very cavalier and casual way, and I wasn't living life with any real purpose or intention. And I guess with time and with age, you learn to understand what's important and sort of build out a life for yourself that is lived that way. And I like the idea of marrying intentionality with authenticity, because as a person who consumes a ton of music and who is a aspiring concert photographer and tour photographer, like being able to have that combination of intentional artistry and authenticity when it comes to these acts, I think that is like a recipe for success. When you go about selecting artists to work with and who you want to be an advocate for, how does that process unfold for you? Like, how do you choose who is a worthwhile partner in what you do?
Yeah, that has been a very magnetic journey. When I made the decision to finally do my own thing outside of starting from an in-house at a management group and then bouncing around the different, amazing agencies in music, I felt like I had this open space where I was just calling it in spiritually. And I think it was more than anything, my energy was just in this open space. I did not go about formally announcing, putting an ad out or calling in favors I completely had this like shift where I was like, all right, let's see what happens. And sure enough, it was as if all of the conversations that I had in the past that really resonated, those were my incoming first clients.
Mm.
And just so happens that the development of whatever campaign or project they were working on, no one was finding a fit and could only find it with me. And so when I first started, I didn't know how to scale my fees. I didn't know how to go about even having my portfolio deck together. This was really based on this key skill set of having authentic conversations, and then kind of in the beginning scrambling to figure out what to do thereafter, because it was such a potent space. Now it's a bit more organized, in which I look at some primary factors that include, am I going to personally consume your music? Where do I see your music? Where can I see it live? I make sure that I do my due diligence before even engaging in like an introduction call, because I want to respect that space and time. And I don't look at this, I mean, from a business standpoint, there's a certain set of criteria that I think, where it's just part of what holds the frame together. And I'm always opening myself to that. But if it's a sacrifice at my own ethos, or in what they're looking for is perhaps not as aligned with the artist development side, I truly feel as though that time spent could be spent proactively elsewhere. And I don't mind saying that straight up. Like, you probably can do better, going elsewhere for the kind of results. Or if I see that an artist isn't where they're supposed to be by the time that they leave in a publicist, I won't recommend it. I think it's actually foolish to recommend that for the sake of, finances. Is like, hey, you're not at that stage, and like, I will give you some consultation as to getting to that stage, but like, hold off on bringing a publicist. I also, right now in the stage that I'm at, I look for a project or a team that I know is going to be a synergetic experience. I'm not in the place that that will accept less accountability, because I think it dilutes the results. So, I want to make sure that the management team is fairly open, fairly responsive, fairly accountable. And of course, the ideology of the project itself, it doesn't always have to be so deep and meaningful, because that's kind of my job, is to like find ways to inject that.
Mm-hmm.
But where I'm at, I'm calling in very meaningful projects that I stand by, that I wish was the way in which I bridge the communication for the next generation. And I'm always thinking of that. I'm always thinking of, how do we provide better role models? How do we add just a little bit more significance to that in which you are creating? How do I highlight that? And if I don't have the answer, I won't take on a client. And I'm very purposeful about that, because I feel, again, as though this is my act of service, and I do not want to disservice a team.
I mean, I love that. I'm very curious. I don't know much about how the music PR world works, but like when you bring a client on, let's say it's an individual singer songwriter, someone who performs, does that relationship, is it like a monthly thing? Is it a yearly thing? Is it based on an album coming out, a single coming out? How do those relationships sort of form on like a timeline horizon? And is it like one of those things where once you bring someone on board, they're almost like a client for life kind of thing?
I think the relationship with the clients that I bring on board kind of keep its affiliation, and I don't mind supporting wherever I can or have the bandwidth outside of our contracts. However, I ask that the commitment be at least 3 months in order to really maximize our job. Again, I'm not in this place where I'm just producing diluted results in a 1 month,
Right.
flash pan span. I'm more about the longevity of your career. And as such, our relationships, sometimes they're seeded and it doesn't yield until 6 months down the road. Sometimes it's the development of years and you're monitoring, and sometimes they are release campaigns, and every cycle is different. In the music release world, you have up through November, I would say, where they're active months, and then you really can't get anyone to do anything for you like past November. So those in editorial become kind of the like roundup, final review, and how we plan for the top of the year. And so knowing the kind of outer structure of that, for a single, it's going to be a little bit, smaller time than for an album. But right now, what we're seeing in the music industry is that given the streaming platforms, there's a lot of music being just pumped out and diluting music journalism. So frustration is, how do we sustain a story and keep quality control over music consumption?
Ooh.
And so it becomes a shift, because now the emerging rise of TikTok and creative content makers and influencers are starting to have a different role in the table conversation. So when I look at the timelines, I think that what I have seen over the years, it is more wise for a management group to look at the timeline from a year perspective and be able to plan the output of their artist on a 3 to 4 month rotation if it's not going to be an album. In that space alone, when you reach a certain breakthrough as an artist and you're kind of creating that like momentum, it's so vital for your career, for the monetization of it, to really sustain that momentum. Because it's not about creating waves, it's about riding the wave into as many different waves and as a tsunami as possible. If not, you'll find a lull between a rising artist that's hitting marks within 1 to 2 years, and then something as simple as just having that 1 to 2 month lull can kind of like slow your like path down.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to make sure that like when I'm involved, what other projects are happening that are going to be forthcoming, not just a single, not just this album, but what is it in your artist career as a brand and as a business that we're looking at from a year perspective? What can I do to set that up so that, let's say a year from now, you don't have me on deck? Again, I want to make sure you have those resources. And at the end of the day, like you always have access to me. It's a little bit limited because we're not on contract. And, you know, there's only so much time, but at least I know that that team is catching another stride and, you know, and we can keep empowering that. So
I think that analogy of the waves is that just struck me big time because like as an artist and a photographer myself, I feel like I am in that cycle, right? Where like, you know, I'm 2 years into a career, right? And I had never done a creative career beyond, you know, starting as a photographer 2 years ago. And
yeah.
it feels like that wave momentum, that crescendo, you're building that tidal wave of work, of productivity. But it is
Mhm.
at times like I didn't shoot last week. Like I didn't get paid to do anything last week. And for me, that was like, whoa, like what's going on? What, you know what I mean? It just like was one of
Mhm.
those lulls like between the holidays and everything that like things were like just
Right.
didn't happen last week. But I love that
Right.
analogy because I've started to feel that each job that I take, each podcast that I do, every model that I shoot, every band that I interact with is just leading to the next thing. And I think that if you're able to believe that you are capable of creating that sustained success for yourself with the aid of wonderful people like yourself, it is possible to get to the point where you're supposed to inevitably be. But I
It,
absolutely love that analogy.
and it's also important to look at the momentum building as a marathon and not a sprint.
Oh yeah.
It is so important to like really try to normalize and habitualize that mantra as soon as possible in order to have the stamina and the lion medicine, if you will, to continue roaring. And so it's not just, you know, at the level that I am and that and as a creative as well, wanting to constantly be in this space and hold space for others. I am adapting my skill sets and my role to a team because I respect the mantra of it being a marathon. So when PR is not relevant to or it's not catching bites, what other resources do I have? Because I believe in this artist and I'm going to leverage those resources in the same way that I believe in myself, I believe in my expansiveness, and I believe in my worth. So how do I prospect different tiers of clients when I am not proactively working on my assignments? How am I leveraging my wisdom and my knowledge in structured ways for an intern so that, you know, I'm not just leaving it on this kind of avoidant attachment of like, we'll figure it out. Like this such bullshit, this like baptism by fire kind of shit that we've like really learned how to like train people in. It's like, no. Like what you're doing is you're completely avoidant that you yourself don't know how to manage a team.
Yeah.
And that's cool, but admit it and
Mm-hmm.
don't bring anyone on. So it's like the same reflection is being orbited in all areas of like my ethos is like, how do I build momentum as an individual entrepreneur? Well, I'm going to put on my business dev cap in between those like campaign seasons. And I'm always going to have the way in which I harvest those seed conversations. That's the ripple effects of the underbelly of that tide. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's not a wave yet, but I know how to seed now. Like I
Yeah.
know how to allow for those conversations to develop. And time again, the number one need that I'm constantly being met with is that people are not feeling heard in this industry whatsoever. People are not feeling heard or represented or seen or catered to, and they're stuck in these contracts of 2+ years where they're not able to then further develop their brand. And it's like, that's where I come in and I go, you don't have to do a 2-year contract with me. Let's just start opening up the dialogue and let me complement your team in this way or that way. And so it just goes back to that where it's like, if it feels forced or you feel restricted, it's not in alignment.
Yeah.
And there's always ways. If we're creative, there's always ways to pull in that stride, but it totally requires you putting yourself out there and being like, I'm totally ready, and now do I have the infrastructure to sustain that when it comes in? And that's a humbling process within itself, you know?
Yeah, for sure. What I think is super cool is that like as I've grown and I've really done the most growth from a business perspective and a creative perspective in the last year, right? That first year was just spent fucking floundering, figuring it out. And
Right.
I've really in like the last 3 months, 4 months, I've really started to hit my stride. But to me, what's beautiful about this path has been like how every opportunity has sort of begotten another opportunity, right? So it's like the
Oh my God, yeah.
interactions that I've had with XYZ band, you meet someone else, you shoot for them. It's like there is, I believe when you're like aligned with your purpose in life, there is a serendipitous nature about things that everything starts kind of falling into place.
Yeah.
It's obviously a lot easier said than done. Like these things take an immense amount of time and stress and anxiety and drama, but eventually
Yeah.
I think you like start realizing you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, and like life sort of rewards you for having trusted in that process and that path. In
Mm-hmm.
your own experience, do you have that self belief that you will be working with XYZ dream client a year from now, 2 years from now? Like, how does that sort of manifest for yourself?
Yeah, I have always been very in tune with the ways in which the universe is communicating in my path.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also very Aries, and I'm stubborn as hell. So I have been through it when it comes to like, will you chill out and like trust that it's happening? And I'm like, but I got rent in the morning, you
Yeah.
know? And it's like there's a combination of just really like coming to terms with your fear and kind of just humorously bantering with it. I do feel like I I have a belief that my dream like clients, I almost don't wouldn't want it in like a year from now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the kind of person that like I'm very like when I'm in my grit, you cannot take me away from my grit. And I will reach those goals. And then the part that's where I'm at in this place, it's like, well, I get to dream of even bigger goals. And it really requires a moment of rest
Hmm.
because it's like, I don't want to be in this place where, I've normalized the stress over the rewards. I think that the clients that I work with now are still my dream clients, you know? They're as potent in my eyes as Beyonce. And that the archetypes of that storytelling are all reflective of each other. So the day that I get to work with Beyonce, it will feel as an archetypal resonance that it does now, working with Bailana. And so it's like in these spaces, I truly feel like what is going to change is simply the platform in which we can put these stories on,
Mm-hmm.
and constantly be that person in those writing rooms that is advocating for that. And if working with a larger, more mainstream artist doesn't allow me to do that, then perhaps those are not the rooms that I'm meant to be in.
Yeah.
And like, I'm perfectly fine, like, just living more in alignment with that.
It's funny. I was on a shoot 2 weeks ago, and like it's like I'm a nerd in that when I get a shot that like I know is the shot that I'm inevitably going to share with the client and or post on social and or the reason why I was hired, right? There's like the one that comes from whatever the shoot is. I still get that like uh excitement, that like nerd out. I'm like, fuck yeah, like like I fucking got it. Like and it's funny, there's nothing like in my life that I've ever done, at least from like a work perspective. Like I was in sales for a long time. When I made a sale, I didn't have that feeling. I didn't have that like visceral excitement that I have when I know that I've
Mhm.
accomplished the thing that I was put here to do. And I think if you are able to do that from a storytelling perspective, regardless of who it is, I think that you will be successful in all of your endeavors, because you come from this in such an inspiringly beautiful place that it is almost impossible for you not to be able to be put in the position to be successful in what you're doing, which I think is tremendous.
Oh, oh, I love that. I so receive that. Oh, yeah, I think it's also a constant reminder of like, I, I don't have to remind myself why I'm doing this work. And because of that, it becomes that of ease.
Yeah.
But it is
Yeah.
but it is not easy.
No,
It
no,
is
no.
not easy. But there's a place of ease in that, in any other situation where it wasn't in alignment, I had to constantly show up and justify and rationalize and constantly find like the needle in a haystack of like why I was at that desk.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like something just clicked one day where it was like, oh my gosh, like someone's dream is to be at this desk. And I'm like taking someone's spot here. It is not mine. So it's like I'm doing a disservice on both ends, the parallel life of what is meant to be at this desk and that which is like, this is not my desk. And so it's like, I find that there's more bandwidth in my energy because I don't have to wake up and be like, I'm doing this job for my kids. I'm doing this job for like, the security. I'm doing this job for the approval of my parents. I'm doing this job because I studied A, B, and C, and I have to do this job. It's like, no, I get to do this job. Oh my gosh, amazing.
Yeah, I joke that every time I show up somewhere with my camera and I get paid for it, I'm like, who did I fucking scam to be able to do this for a living? Because it's like one of those things where I'd never experienced that before I figured out what I was supposed to do with my life. I never had that reassurance, that like self-confidence of I was put here to make beautiful images. And to some degree, I get the same sort of life high doing these podcasts and having these conversations because I know there is value in what we're providing here today, that someone's going to listen to this conversation and be like, hey, maybe I'm not happy in my job. Maybe, maybe I want to be doing something else. Maybe I want to start my own career. Maybe I want to go be a fucking doctor or a lawyer or a nurse or a teacher or whatever. And I know that like when you figure out the things that you're supposed to be doing in your life, everything starts adding up, and 1 + 1 = 2, and you get to inevitably be like, who the fuck did I scam to be able to be this happy doing the thing I love to do?
Oh my goodness. And you know what? In your body of work, I see that there's a moment in which you capture that is so intimate.
Thank you.
And I'm like, oh my God, like even just that gaze alone is how I feel when there's a moment in which I feel almost like an artist therapist, if you will, or a brand life coach. And it's a moment of like, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, whoa, like, that's awesome. What an honor to witness you. And if that means that it's only translated in a one-liner in a press release or a caption on a post, or it doesn't even get translated right now, but there's a breakthrough of like, you know what? There's this part of my story where blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, brother, sister, human, yes. Like, and that's how I feel when I see your images, where I'm like, there's this moment where it's like, how did you catch that nuance? How were you able to preserve? And now we can preserve and capture that moment and hopefully do justice to what we felt in that space. And the artists themselves, it's so peripheral. It's such a blind spot.
Mm-hmm.
Not always can the artist or the muse see that.
Yeah, I think first of all, thank you. That was very much appreciated. I think when it comes to how I'm able to do it, there's a cheat code in that I am incredibly intentional about when I press the button. And the reason why I'm intentional is because my photography career started in film, right? So you had to be incredibly mindful about how many pictures you're taking because that shit is expensive and you can't just blast 1,000 photos. So I don't shoot on like what would be like a high burst mode for a digital camera, because I don't think it is doing any service to the moment that I'm in. So if I'm shooting a concert, or if I'm shooting with models, or I'm shooting for a brand, whatever I'm doing, I'm shooting on single shot mode, because for me, there has to be intent behind why I press the button. And if I ever lose that, I'm going to be able to lose what I'm trying to do as I tell these stories. And I think to a lot of degree, if people live their lives with a bit more intention, if people were able to put a lot more intention into the things that they do, again, life could be a lot easier.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you 100%.
Lluvia, man, I gotta say, I'm incredibly thankful to have had you on the podcast today. That was just such a wonderful, wonderful, life affirming conversation. And shout out to Sienna for putting us together to have this conversation. I have an extremely cheesy line. If you've been on my podcast, you're part of my family. I am just immensely thankful that you were able to come on today and have this conversation with me about life and music and art and intentionality. And I know you're going to be incredibly successful in your life. And just thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much, brother. That was such a special space, honestly.
You're welcome.